All right, if you're studying international relations, you know the name, realism. It is absolutely one of the most foundational, most important traditions in the whole field. But here's the thing, it's also one of the most misunderstood. So if you're gearing up for exams, getting a solid grip on realism isn't just a good idea, it's pretty much essential for understanding how so much of the world works. You know, let's kick things off with this quote from William Wohlforth, because it really hits the nail on the head. He says the entire field of IR is basically just one long debate about realism. Just let that sink in for a second. Almost every other major theory you'll study, liberalism, constructivism, you name it, they all pretty much define themselves by arguing against realism. It's the sun that all the other planets orbit. So if you don't get realism, you really can't get the full picture of what its critics are even talking about.
So that brings us to the big question, right? If this theory is so central, why does everyone seem to get it wrong? As we're about to see, it's way too common for people, critics and even some fans, to argue against the simplified cartoon version of realism, a straw man. Our job today is to cut through all that noise and get to what realism actually says about the world.
Okay, so to really get to the bottom of this, we've got a clear roadmap. First, we're going to bust the single biggest myth about realism. Then, we'll build it back up from scratch, looking at its 4 core principles. After that, we'll trace how it's evolved, look at the big debates, check out the modern schools of thought, and dive into its most powerful analytical theories. And finally, we'll see where realism is at today. I promise, by the end of this, you'll have a super clear framework that'll be a huge help for your studies.
Right. First things first, let's get straight to that huge misunderstanding. Is realism just one single monolithic theory, or is it actually something way bigger and, frankly, a lot more interesting?
Here it is, the biggest mistake people make. The idea that you can boil this entire tradition, which spans centuries, down to one simple theory. Our source material calls this the taproot of the greatest misunderstanding, and that's a perfect way to put it. Almost all the bad critiques of realism grow from this one single error. So let's fix that right now.
So, what's the truth? This quote absolutely nails it. Realism isn't one theory. It's a rich, diverse, intellectual tradition. The best way to picture it is as a big tent. Under this tent, you have a whole bunch of different, sometimes even competing, theories. For instance, you have some realists who say states should only want enough power to be safe, while others say states should try to get as much power as possible. They both get to be in the realist tent because they share the same core DNA, the same foundational assumptions about the world.
So if realism is this giant, diverse tent, what are the poles holding it up? What are the basic beliefs that tie all these thinkers together, from ancient historians like Thucydides all the way to scholars today? Well, it turns out they all pretty much agree on 4 central principles.
First up is groupism. The basic idea here is that humans are group animals. We live in groups, we survive in groups. And that loyalty we feel to our own group, our in-group, is what makes conflict with other groups or out-groups possible. And for realists looking at the world today, the most important groups by far are states.
Second, we have egoism. Realists argue that when you strip everything else away, political action is driven by self-interest. They see this as a pretty fundamental part of human nature. Now, this doesn't mean everyone is a monster all the time. Good laws and institutions can help us cooperate. But it's why realists get super skeptical whenever a country claims its foreign policy is all about helping others and not about what's in it for them. Now, here's where things get really interesting. You take those first 2 principles and you drop them into the world of international politics, which is defined by the 3rd principle, anarchy. And this is so important. Anarchy does not mean chaos and disorder. In IR, it just means there's no world government. There's no 911 to call if another state attacks you. This creates what's called a self-help system, where every state has to look out for number 1. And this brings us to the 4th principle, which is basically the logical outcome of the other 3. What happens when you have self-interested groups, that's groupism and egoism, operating in a system with no higher authority? That's anarchy. Well, the result is power politics. The constant struggle for power and the search for security become the main story of international relations. It just has to be that way. Okay, so even though everyone in the Big Ten agrees on those basics, the ideas themselves have definitely evolved. And the biggest, most important shift in modern times was the move from what we call classical realism to neorealism. This timeline kind of shows you the big moments. After World War II, you've got classical realism with Hans Morgenthau as the leading voice. Then
Boom! 1979. Kenneth Waltz publishes a game-changing book that launches what we now call neorealism, or sometimes structural realism. And that in turn set off a whole new generation of debates that are still going on today.
So what is the big difference here? This is a key point for any exam. For classical realists like Morgenthau, the reason we have conflict is because of flawed human nature, that egoistic drive for power inside all of us. But for neorealists like Waltz, the problem isn't what's inside our heads, it's the structure of the system itself. He said that anarchy forces states to compete for power, even if their leaders are saints. Here's the best way to remember it. Classical realism blames the players, while neorealism blames the game.
Waltz's theory was so influential, it basically created a brand new debate inside the realist tent. So now, pretty much everyone agreed that the anarchic system was the key. But they started arguing about just how dangerous that system really is. Does anarchy always force states to be aggressive, or can they find ways to feel secure without constantly fighting? And that disagreement gave rise to three main modern schools of realist thought.
Now, this table is a fantastic study tool, so let's walk through it. First, you've got defensive realists. They say, look, anarchy is real, but it's not a constant nightmare. States should just get enough power to be safe, because trying to take over the world is a dumb idea that usually backfires. Then you have the offensive realists, like John Mearsheimer. They say, no way. In an anarchic world, you can never be sure who's a threat, so the only smart move is to become the biggest, baddest state on the block. And finally, you have neoclassical realists, who try to split the difference. They say, okay, the system pushes states around, for sure, but how a state reacts depends on what's going on inside that state, who the leaders are, what their government is like.
Okay, so we've gone over the big schools of thought. Now let's zoom in a bit. The realist tradition gives us a whole toolkit of specific theories that we can use to actually analyze what's happening in the world. These are the workhorses of realist analysis.
Two of the most famous are about balancing. You've got the classic balance of power theory, which says states will always team up to stop any one country from getting too powerful and taking over. But then Stephen Walt came along and refined this with his balance of threat theory. He argued that states don't just balance against power, they balance against threats. So a country might be way more worried about its weaker but really aggressive next-door neighbor than it is about a super powerful country that's far away and minds its own business. It's not just about how many tanks you have, it's about what you plan to do with them. And that leads us to one of the most brilliant and tragic ideas in all of IR, the security dilemma. Picture this. A country feels a little insecure, so it builds up its military, just for defense. But its neighbor sees all these new weapons and thinks, uh-oh, are they planning to attack me? So that neighbor builds up its military. What's the result? Both countries spent a ton of money, they're both more scared, and nobody is actually safer than when they started. The Cold War arms race is the perfect, terrifying example of this vicious cycle.
Realism also has some big ideas about why we have periods of peace and periods of major war. Hegemonic stability theory says that the world is most stable and prosperous when there's one overwhelmingly powerful state, a hegemon that can basically act as the world's sheriff. Power transition theory is the other side of that coin. It argues that the most dangerous time in world history is when a rising power starts to catch up to the top dog. That's when you're most likely to see a massive war to decide who gets to be in charge.
So, after all that, where does realism stand today? Well, the source text suggests we're now in an age of what you could call modest realism. The big, epic battles to prove that realism was the one and only master theory have kind of fizzled out.
And this new vibe is defined by three big trends. First, like I said, the paradigm wars have cooled off. Realists aren't as focused on shouting that they're right and everyone else is wrong. Second, this has led to much more interesting conversations. You see realists borrowing ideas from other theories, and vice versa, to build better, more complete explanations. And third, the research has become much more practical. Instead of just debating big, abstract ideas, realists are using their tools to solve specific, real-world foreign policy puzzles. And that leaves us with this final thought to chew on. Maybe the real, lasting strength of realism isn't in being one single theory that explains everything. Maybe its real power is that it has evolved into this incredible, diverse toolkit, a set of sharp analytical lenses that help us see and understand the timeless realities of power and security in a world that, let's face it, never stops being complicated.